Hello devs, today I will be showing you how to use the Stripe API with your MERN Stack application. For simplicity, I will have an already built MERN Stack app which you can fork from this GitHub repo, which I will also leave the link below, or you can watch this tutorial and then implement the solutions from this video into your own project. In this project, you would have all the products listed out as cards. We can click on the product and we can choose a size. And when we add a size, we'll get a toast as well as the product added to our cart. Now when we go to the cart, we're able to increment the count and see the total for how much the products are going to cost. We can also delete the product and showcase that our cart is empty. So now if we go back and add a product, we can go to, say, add more. We can check out, and then we can fill in all our information. Then when we hit pay, we'll be redirected to our successful page and showcase all the products that we purchased. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. First things first, let's go over what Stripe is exactly. Stripe is a tech company that provides online payment processing services. It offers a platform that enables businesses to accept payments over the internet. Stripe's services include payment gateway functionality, which allows merchants to accept credit card payments and other online payment methods. Basically, in short, Stripe allows users to manage payments and subscriptions online through a Stripe account. And once you finish creating a Stripe account, you would be navigated to a dashboard similar to this. And this is where you manage all of your payments, which you would be able to see here, and your balances, any customers that you might have, like that come back to make more purchases on whatever application you implement this with, and as well as billing statements. Now that we know what Stripe is, let's start implementing it. So as you can see here, we have API keys for developers. Now, when you go to these, you do not want to share these. You want to put these in an env file in the project. When you log into Stripe, you would be put into a test mode. And what this does is it's all fake data. So you could test out their API with no issues and no worries of something going wrong and you getting charged. So that's why they give you this neat functionality to just test out all the payment methods and things like that you would want to put into your application. Whenever you're ready to take off test mode, you just click on test mode and go to activate your account. And you would have to change the API keys to the non-test mode ones so that you could actually start receiving payments. But only do that after you've done vigorous testing and made sure everything works as expected. Now that we know what Stripe is, let's start implementing it. First, we want to create an account with Stripe. And once we have our Stripe account created, we can then use our Stripe's private keys to access our account with Stripe. Now remember, we want to keep these secret. So when we place them in our application, we want to put them inside our .env file within our server file. Now within this application that I created, we will navigate to server. And then I had already created an env file. And in this env file, we would want to copy and paste those two API keys, like so. So for the publishable key, we could just write stripe underscore publishable underscore key equals to, and then we would go back to our Stripe developers dashboard and just copy the publishable key. Then we could go back to our env file and paste that in, and we would do the same thing for the private key, or the secret key, if you want to call it. So we would say stripe underscore secret underscore key equals, and then we would copy that, field key, continue, copy it, go back to our env, paste it, and save. And that's pretty much all you have to do for this env. And then if the keys ever change, you just have to come back and manually change it here. Also, make sure to never reveal these keys, because then other people could possibly use them and then start doing malicious things with them. So it's always good to place them in your env file so that it's never pushed to GitHub where people could see. Now that we have our Stripe keys, we want to create our products. So these will be the products that are going to be fetched when we do our API call to get the product that we want to charge for the person, right? So we could go back to here, our Stripe dashboard for developers, and you want to click more. And then when you click more, you'd be given a list of different things to choose from. And what we want is product catalog. Now we're going to click product catalog. And what I like to do is I like to pin it so that it's always there and you could just always come back to it. Now all we have to do is add product. And then this is where you would start filling in all the information for your products. And so I'm going to skip ahead and fill in all of the products. Now that we have all of our products inside of our product catalog, we can click on any of these products and scroll down a bit, and you can see we have our products API ID. And this will be useful to us later when we need our client to fetch this product to charge them for this specific product. Now that we finished creating our Stripe account and implementing our API keys into our env file, we then want to start working on our backend to start having that connection with our server to our Stripe account. So what we could do is we could navigate to routes and then go to billing.js. And in here you could see I left a few comments. And these are just where to place where our code should be for what specific things we're trying to do. So right now we need to create our store items. And what our store items is basically the API endpoints that's connected from our client to our backend. We're going to translate that so that in our backend we can price it right, because you don't want to send the prices from the front end to the back end as it is, because then people could just change the prices in the front end if they know how to in the term or in the developer tools, and we don't want that, right? So we need to get those prices from the back end so that it can't be altered or changed in any way. So now what we want to do is we're going to create our store items, and it's going to be an object, and we're going to have this key, right, that we're getting from the client, and we want to specify what this key is going to be for, so that we don't lose track of what is what, right? So this key is going to be for the burger block. And then here, we're going to have the price, and we're going to pass in that API ID that we had looked at earlier. So we could go to that right now. And this is going to be for the burger block. So we're going to go back to our product catalog. And we're going to look for a burger black shirt. We're going to click on this. And we're going to take this API ID. We could copy it. And then we could go back to here and just paste that in. And right now, I have them already preset for the IDs that are going to be sent from the client to the backend. But you would just put whatever ID you have in your client to the backend. And yeah, so I would skip ahead and fill this out for the rest of the video. Now that we have our store items in place, we want to create a checkout session. So what we can do is we are going to do router.post / and this is the way that Stripe's API documentation has it, is you want to create -checkout -session, and we're going to do an async function, the request and response arrow function, and we're going to do a try catch block. Catch error. We could just do a console.error or console.log create checkout session error. Pass in the error. And we also want to do a status 500.json error create checkout session error and pass in the error. Now in this endpoint, we're going to be sending three things. We want to send our items, we want to send our success URL, and our cancel URL. So our items will be an object which will contain all the data of the specific item we're trying to buy, whether it's small, large. You could pass in the color, you could pass in just the ID, which would probably be the preferred way, and the success URL, which is going to be a query URL that we're going to send back to the client so that it could reroute us to it when we have a successful purchase. And then a cancel URL, which in this case I just put it to go back to the cart menu, so that when the person cancels the transaction, it just takes them right back to where they were. So to do this, we can do cons, and we want to extract items, success URL, cancel URL from our body. So the object that we are trying to send to this API endpoint should look something similar to this. We have our items, we have an array, which is going to contain multiple objects of the different items, and in this object, I will be passing in title, image, ID, quantity, and size, which you actually don't need to for this case. It would work just fine with just this ID, which would be right here, which is the ID that we're going to be passing in. But say you want to add more stuff, like you want to specify certain things, this is how you would go about it. But for this case, we're only going to be needing the ID. So now what we can do is we want to take the items and we want to filter it out with all of these. We want to extract the price from the ID. So to do this, we're going to do const line items equals items.map item. We're going to do an arrow function, and we're going to do an if statement. We want to check if store items with that item ID exists within our object. If it doesn't exist, sorry. If it doesn't exist, we want to throw a new error. Tell the server that there is an invalid product ID. So basically we don't have it. We don't have that product. We can do a query item.id. So now if everything is good and there is, if we find every product ID, then we just want to return the price of that store items item.id is price. We also want to return the quantity because this is how much that person's going to be buying of that item. Item.quantity, which we are taking from the object that we sent. Next, we want to create Stripe's checkout session, which I will be following from this Stripe's docs page. And if you have any more questions, you could ask me in the comments or go to this page and it would have everything you need to know. But to create our Stripe's checkout session, we want to do const session equals await stripe dot checkout dot session dot create, and then we will have a payment method types and then you could put card or Cash App. There's also many other payment methods that you could add, but for now we'll just be using these two. And the mode we want is going to be payment. And if you were to do a subscription, you would change payment to subscription. Next, we want to do shipping address. We want to collect the shipping address for where we want to ship these products. And Stripe would give us the invoice and for where to ship these products to. And we could also specify the specific countries that we want to ship to, or that we'll accept shipping to. We could just do that by doing allowed countries. And then we could specify which countries we will ship to. So US and Canada. And like I said before, you could always go back to the documentation and it will show you all the countries that are available for shipping. Next, we want to add our line items. And this is the important part because this is where we have all of the items that we need to get from Stripe. And that's why we needed these API keys, or API IDs, sorry, to place inside of our line items. So we created that here in line items. We could just pass that in here. Next, we want to create our success URL and our cancel URL. And we know we passed in those URLs through our JSON object. So we can do success URL. And then we can pass in success URL because we are fetching it from the body up here. And then we can query session ID equals checkout session ID. And what this does is it's going to take our checkout session ID and we're going to send it to our client. And our client is going to reroute it to this ID, which will show that user's checkout ID, which will contain all of their history for that purchase, which we can then use to check out all the information of that purchase. Next, we want to create the cancel URL, which will just be cancel URL. And finally, all we have to do is just send our session URL and our session ID. So we can just do res.json curly brackets URL session dot URL comma session ID and then session dot ID. So we are sending in the session ID and the session URL back to our client when the user finishes checkout. Finally, in our server, we want to create another API endpoint to check the status of their checkout session. So we want to see, did their payment go through or did it fail? So if it went through, we'll send them information saying, hey, good, your payment went through. And if it failed, we'll tell them, hey, your payment failed. So to do this, we're going to do router.get. We're just going to create a session status. We're going to do session ID because that's what we're going to be passing in. So we could check from the URL what the status of their checkout session is. Do a simple request response with the arrow function. We're going to retrieve that session ID from the URL by using request.params. Then we could create a simple try catch block. Error. Now it's always recommended that you be more specific with your errors, but for simplicity sakes, we will just do internal server errors for these. And then just pass in the error so you could see what the error is. Now in our try, we want to do const session. Now this is the way that Stripe handles the Stripe API handles giving you back the session ID data. So when that user finishes purchasing a product, we get their session ID. Now with that session ID, we are going to create this API endpoint to retrieve an object of all that information. And to see what that looks like, you can go to the Stripe docs API checkout session. And right here, this is what the response would look like. When fetching. So now in our const session, we want to do an await, because we have async await stripe dot checkout dot session dot retrieve session ID. And now all we have to do is do response.json, and we just pass in that session. Now, believe it or not, this is all the code that we'll need to connect our MERN stack app to Stripe. Now that we finished setting up our Stripe API endpoints on our server side, we can now start working with our client and creating those connections. So let's take a look at our client. So we can do Control J to pop up the terminal. And we're going to create two terminals. We're going to have one called a server and another called client. And here we can just do ls, change directory to client, and then we can go here and change directory to server. Now we can do npm start. Now that we know that it's starting on port 5000, we could refresh port 5000 and we can see our server is live. Now in our client, we can do npm start. And in just a moment, it would show us our client. So now that our client and server are up and running, and we can see that they're working just as expected, we can now start working on the integration of our client to our server. So first things first, we can exit this out, and we want to start working on our API calls in our client folder. So we could go to source, API, and billing. Now in billing, we want to first import Axios from Axios, as this is what's going to be used to fetch our API calls. Next, we want to get our server URL. So we could do var server underscore URL equals process.env.react underscore app underscore server underscore URL. Now that we have our imports done, we can start working on creating our first API call. So our first API call is going to be the create checkout session that we did in our server. So to do that, we can do export const create checkout equals async user credentials. We're going to do an arrow function. We're going to let our response equal await Axios dot post because we're going to be creating this post request. We're going to do backticks. We're going to pass in our server URL, and we're going to pass in billing, create, checkout, session, because this is our route. So if we were to comment this out, if we were to console.log this, it would be our route in our server. So if we go to our server, you can see we have this route, and then we're adding in the billing route from here. Just adding all that up together. So we can exit this out, go back to our billing and our client. And now we want to pass in our user credentials. So what is going through this user credentials is, if you remember when we were working on the server, is we were passing in these objects, right? So we were passing in our items objects, which is the items in our cart that the user's trying to check out with. We're passing in a success URL to redirect the user when the payment is successful, and a cancel URL for when the user just doesn't want to go through the checkout process and wants to go back to our homepage. So that's what user credentials is when we're passing it in. And that's what we're going to be sending to this API endpoint that we created. Now we can do a check. So if response is true, we can do a const URL session ID. Because remember, that's what we're returning when the response is true. So we want to get the URL and session ID from our response, from our API call. And we are going to pass that to our client in an object. We're passing in URL and session ID. Now, else, if we couldn't get the URL or the session ID, or both, we want to return could not create checkout session. And then we could return the response, which would tell us what went wrong. The next API billing call we want to create is the session data call. So basically the status, right? So remember, we created a status endpoint in our billing in our server. So we want to fetch that here. So we can do export const session data call equals async user credentials. Okay, add an error function and then do a simple try catch block with the error. Then we can just do a console.error error fetching session data. And then we can pass in the error. And then in our try, we can do const response equals await axios dot get, and we are going to pass in our server. Pass in our server URL because that's what we're communicating with. Pass in billing session, and I believe we had it as status, and we also want to pass in user credentials dot session ID, because that's what we were getting from our user credentials. Oh, user credentials. There we go. Then we want to return our response.data. So this will be the object like I showed you guys before in the server of all the information from that user's checkout session. So now that we have our API billing call finished, we can now call these in our cart. So we could go to our cart, and within our cart, I've created another comment to show where it should be placed under handle cart checkout. We want to do const handle checkout equals async arrow function and a simple try catch. Then we can do console.error. Could not create checkout session. Then in our try block, I am using a npm package, which is to tell the user that if they have no items in their cart. So to show that, we can do cart.length is equal to 0, or there is no cart. Then we can do an object of show toast, and then alert, you have no items in your cart. And then you could pass in info. This is just how I have it set up here. If you're curious on how toasts are, you could look at this, or let me know in the comments below and I'll show you guys how to set this up. But to continue, we can do const client URL equals process.env.react app underscore client underscore URL. Then we can create our user credentials that we're going to be sending to our API endpoint. Const user credentials equals an object with our items, which is going to be cart. So cart is a use context that I created that stores all of our users' items that they added to the cart. So this is just all the items that the person has in their cart as an object. Then we can do success URL, and we can pass in our client underscore URL and then success. And then we can do the same thing for cancel. So we could do cancel underscore URL, backticks, $, curly braces, client underscore URL, and then go back to cart because we just want to send them back to where they were. Now we can use our user credentials and the API call we created in billing.js by doing const response equals await create checkout. And then we could pass in our user credentials. Then we can store our checkout session ID in our local storage so that we can use it later on. So local storage dot set item checkout session ID comma res dot session ID. Now we can have our page relocate to that session URL. So we can just do window dot location equals res dot URL. Okay, so we need to make sure that the price ID needs to match up to the corresponding product that you want. So this is a taco shirt white. We'll take the API ID and go back to our store items, and we want to make sure that it has the correct price ID, and you want to do that for all of the products. Sorry, I forgot we needed to add one more thing. Back when we were working on our server, we needed to import our Stripe secret key. So to do that, we could do const stripe equals require stripe, and then do another brackets, and then process dot env dot stripe underscore secret underscore key. I also forgot that we needed to install Stripe. So in your server terminal, make sure we run npm I Stripe. Okay, so I've made a few errors in my code. The first, which we went over, was in our billing.js on our server side. We needed to write this line to get our Stripe key from our env file, which is used right here. And another error within our server side billing is we have this line here called Stripe checkout sessions.create. Now I forgot an S here at the end of sessions, so just make sure to add that. And one final error I made was I mistakenly put billing. So you might have billing here when in fact it should be API, because that is the way we are going to be reaching this API endpoint. So it should be our server URL API/create checkout session. And you could also do the same for our session data call in our APIs folder. So just change this from billing to API. And this should fix any issues that might have happened. So now if we open up our terminal, we can now do npm start to start our server. We can now see our server is live. Now we could go back to our code and go to our client terminal and do npm start. And this should pop up our client side. Okay, now that we have our project up and running, we can go to our cart, and you can see here we have one item. We could also increase the amount or decrease it. But for this case, let's just use one item. We can hit checkout. And we can see now we are being redirected to Stripe's checkout. And you can see we have all the information needed to fill in to check out our product. And if we click back, this will take us back to our cart page. So we can see now that this is working as expected. And all that's left to do is handle the transaction page. So now we could close this. And we want to head to our transaction page. We could also do Control-J to close our terminal. And now within our transaction page, we want to call an API endpoint that we created on our server to get the status of our purchase. So when the user is finished going through the payment process, it would redirect them to this transaction page where they could see the status of their purchase. So we'll display whether the purchase was successful or whether it failed. And we'll also display all of their products that they had bought. So now what we want to do is we want to create a use effect to run automatically when the person is redirected here. We would create a use effect so that the first thing that happens is it fetches the status of their purchase as soon as this page is loaded. So we could use the use effect. We'll do a simple use effect. Now what we can do is use this previous cart that's stored at the top up here to save the user's cart items before we clear out the cart. Because after someone purchases from their cart, you want to empty out the cart. But we still want all those items so that we can display it nicely for the user. So what I can do here is do set previous cart to cart if cart exists. Else, just display it as null. Now we can fetch our data to see the status of our purchase. So we can do const fetch status equals async, and then we can do an arrow function. We can do const session data equals await session data call. And then we can just pass in our session ID, which is the ID given to us from Stripe when we had gone through the checkout process. And this ID is used to get all the information of that specific purchase. Now we're going to need the total amount of the purchased product. So to have that already calculated for us, we can just do const amount total equals session data dot amount underscore total. And then we could just format that. Const formatter equals new. We can do until dot number formatter en-us comma curly braces style is going to be currency, and currency is going to be US dollars. And this would help format the numbers given from Stripe into something more readable in US dollars. Now we can do const formatted amount total equals formatter dot format amount total divided by 100, and this converts from cents to dollars, because Stripe is going to be giving you the total in cents. So this here would just format the cents to dollars. Then we can do if formatted amount total is set total to formatted amount total. And we're going to set it up here so that we can display it nicely for the user to see. Then we can do if session data. We can set session details to session data dot payment status. So when we receive this session data, this will return our object that was shown in that I showed you guys before of what Stripe gives you in an object. So this is what it's going to be returned as, and we want to access the payment status within that object. So we're setting our session details up here to our session data.payment status. So now we would get one of two things, whether the user's payment was successful or not. Now what we want to do is clear our cart, because for simplicity, we're just going to clear it regardless if their payment went through or not. But typically, I think you would clear it only if the payment went through, which would be pretty easy to do. But for now, let's just clear it all together. So let's just say set cart from previous, and then do previous equals an empty array, because that's the default value that we had it. Now we also want to clear the local storage, because we're storing our cart in local storage, so that when the user refreshes the page, all the data stays persistent. So we could do local storage dot set item. We're going to target cart in our local storage. We're going to do JSON dot stringify, and we're going to set that to an empty array. Then we can do fetch product data. Okay, sorry, we don't need this fetch product data, so we can actually remove this as we're not using it. And finally, we can just do set loading to false to show that we're no longer doing this use effect, that the use effect has now finished, or this function has now finished, sorry. And then to finish it off, we can just fetch our status, and it is in function, so we're gonna write it that way. We can save it. And now, we also need to import the use effect at the top. I never added the square brackets. Okay, so I ended up having the same error again, and it's because I keep forgetting this S at the end of sessions here. So just make sure to add that in for the session status API call in billing routes. And now, after we finished building out this use effect, it should work as expected. So we can go around and see everything is working in our application. We can add a few items to our cart. We could go to our cart now. You can see you could still increment, decrement, or delete the item altogether. And then we can do checkout. You can see our items are here. We can fill in our information. And we want to do the 4-2 again. Then we can hit pay. And there we go. Now we can see our items have been purchased successfully. And we could also see the items that we have purchased as well as the total. If you guys have any questions or concerns, please do leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. And that's all for today, and until next time, thanks for watching.